Welcome to Ego Over Id, the psychology of everything, where we explore the science of what makes us human and the stories that make us feel it. I'm Dr. Austin Attaway, an organizational psychologist, professor, and mental health advocate. Each episode will explore the psychology behind our everyday lives and the complexities of our experiences. Whether you're here to understand yourself, others, or the world around you just a little better, you're in the right place. This is where research meets real life. So grab your coffee, take a breath, and let's dive in. Today we're diving into a topic that sits at the intersection of identity, power, and social change, the psychology of women in leadership. Women make up nearly half of the workforce, but their leadership journeys continue to be shaped by cultural expectations, gendered norms, and the invisible load of work and family roles. Leadership isn't just about roles or titles, it's a psychological process shaped by confidence, opportunity, bias, resilience, and the stories that we learn to tell about who actually belongs at the top. Right now, less than 11% of Fortune 500 companies are led by women. This is the highest that it's ever been on record. And to help us explore all of this, we're joined by Dr. Sherylle Tan, a developmental psychologist, researcher, author, and one of the leading voices in the study of women in leadership. She was the co-editor of the Women's Leadership Journeys, series co-editor of SAGE's teaching case studies on women in leadership, and a longtime member and former chair of the International Leadership Association's Women in Leadership membership community. And she's currently serving as the director of internship and research at the Kravis Leadership Institute at Claremont McKenna College. Her work spans leadership development, gender and leadership, and work and family dynamics. So basically, everything that shapes how women lead and how organizations can better support them. So whether you're a leader, a future leader, or someone who cares about creating a more just and effective workplace, we're glad that you're here to join us today. Sherylle, welcome to Ego Over Id.
Thank you so much, Austin. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you. I mean, this is such an important topic. As we're recording this, I'm actually teaching a work and family psychology class. And a big part of it is, these bleeding over, spillover and crossover roles that women have to deal with when they're, working in caregiving. And so I'm excited to talk about that. I know a lot of our listeners are going to be excited to hear what you have to share. But what I really want to know, just kind of off the bat, how did you get drawn into this field? How did you get into, researching women in leadership?
That's a great question. I got into this area by accident, actually. So my background and my training is in applied developmental psychology. And my early work was looking at the impact of parenting on young children, primarily preschool-aged children. And so that's what I did my dissertation and my graduate work around. Once I completed my doctorate, I did some work in children's mental health clinics and did evaluation work. From there, I made my way to Claremont McKenna College, where I'm at now. I've been here for a little over 20 years, and I started working with the Berger Institute for Work, Family, and Children. At the time, their research focus was on work and family. And so the children piece appealed to me and my background. And in looking at the connections, parenting, I started to do work on maternal employment and the impact of maternal employment on child development. Well, that led to one thing and another, and I made my way to the Kravis Leadership Institute. There was a need at the Institute looking at leadership development. And I was like, well, how do these connect? Well, they connect through the issues that women face as they strive to develop as leaders and as they advance through leadership. And so that's where the connection, it's a long, convoluted story.
Yeah.
There's more to it, but by accident, really. So a colleague of mine who is an expert in leadership told me, why don't you come to KLI, the Kravis Leadership Institute, and work with us and our research? And I thought, why not? I'll learn about leadership. I'll try and bring connects to what I already know. My area was developmental psychology, leadership development, seemed like a good fit for bridging that together. And as I learned more about leadership theories, leadership ideas, and development, I saw the connections to the work that I had previously done on work and family, primarily with gender. And that then became really important because I then saw all the linkages and the importance that gender and our ideas of gender have in how we perceive leadership, how we understand who can or cannot lead. And that became really important and became basically my purpose in how I sought out to develop myself and who I wanted to develop as leaders.
That's awesome. I think some of those trajectories seem to be some of the most rich trajectories where you really find that
Right.
purpose kind of by accident, right? Was there a moment, a project, something you learned as all of that started to come weaving together for you that really made it all kind of click and be like, yeah, I'm ready to dedicate my life to this, or at least, your work and research life to it?
So I got involved with the International Leadership Association when I started working with the Kravis Leadership Institute as a way to start to understand this leadership area, this leadership scholarship around leadership, going to the conferences through the International Leadership Association. And by being a part of that association, I became a part of the Women in Leadership membership community. And in that membership community, I had the opportunity to work with other academics, scholars, practitioners in that particular area, and began to really understand this area of women in leadership. From there, I began to really connect with one person in particular that I've been working with for the last, I don't know, decade or so, Lisa DeFrank Cole. She's at West Virginia University, and a lot of the work that I've done has been in partnership with Lisa and has focused on women in leadership primarily. The chapters we've written, the research, the articles. We wrote a textbook on women in leadership that was awarded a textbook award. And so all of that work has really come about through the connections I made at the ILA in my journey of learning about leadership, learning about the theoretical approaches, learning about the psychology, the sociology, the gender studies, the various disciplines that look at leadership from a gendered lens.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point that kind of pivots into a couple of things that I do want to ask about. That this really is a transdisciplinary space,
Yes.
and before we kind of dive into what those different disciplines are and their cross sections, um, what are some immediate misconceptions that you think people have when they think about women in leadership, and what are we really talking when we say women in leadership, and what is this differentiation? Why isn't it just leadership?
Absolutely. It should be just leadership,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That should be how it is. However, the study of women in leadership or gender in leadership didn't really begin until the 70s.
Mm.
And that coincides with women entering the formal workforce.
Mm.
So scholars, researchers began to ask, well, can women lead? Because the formal workforce tended to consist of men in leadership positions. Early scholars and early research on leadership focused on who was leading, which typically were men. So one of the earliest theories in leadership is the great man theory, and the
Mm.
word man is deliberately used in that particular theory because they were looking at those leaders and the type of traits that made good leaders. And most of those examples were men. So historically, we come from a culture or a system in which men had the formal leadership positions. And
Mm.
so women weren't really considered as leaders at that time. And there are many cases in which women's leadership has been erased or is invisible in many ways. And so really understanding the importance of women and promoting women as leaders is essential and important. As you mentioned earlier in the introduction, about 50% of the workforce are women. However, the leadership does not reflect that population of women being represented at all. And that is an issue when certain voices, certain ideas are not being valued in that same way. And so, because we've seen men in leadership positions, we don't have a lot of women role models as leaders. And because we don't have a lot of women role models, the assumption is that women either can't or don't lead, which is not the correct assumption, right?
Of course.
And so gender biases come into play in many ways. Also impacting women's leadership is the lack of not just role models, but also networks or mentors or sponsors who are similar to them. Most of those who have the power or those leadership opportunities have been men. And so women don't have the same access to the same networks that men do. And perhaps if they do have a woman mentor, that woman mentor may be mentoring many versus men where there are many men mentors. There is a small number of women mentors and a large number of men mentors. And that's not to say that men can't mentor women,
Of course.
in their occupation and as leaders, but that is an issue that we often see. And that really connects to what is called second generation gender bias. So second generation gender bias has to do with these subtle attitudinal behaviors and actions that promote the status quo. And by promoting the status quo, we inadvertently advantage men in leadership, especially. Some of the causes of second generation gender bias are these things that I've just mentioned: lack of role models, lack of access to mentors and sponsors. Gendered work is also another cause of second generation gender bias. And the double bind is when women have to basically walk this tightrope of being liked and being seen as competent. Basically, women can't be seen as both. Women, if they are acting in accordance to how we think women should act, for example, being kind, being caring, they're liked. People like them. They think they're a great person. But that doesn't necessarily equate with them being seen as a competent leader. If they act as what we think a competent leader should act like, being assertive, being self-confident, being very dominant, that goes against or is incongruent to what we think a woman should act like. Some of the stereotypes we might have for women. While those might be appropriate as a leader and she might be seen as competent, we might not think of her as likable. And that's the double bind that women face, which leads to second generation gender bias. Bias exists. Fortunately, there are policies in place that prevent what we might know as explicit first generation gender bias, such as firing a woman simply because she's pregnant or anything like that. But the second generation gender bias is a form of implicit bias that continues to exist.
More subtle, hard to see.
Yeah, exactly. And can be a challenge for women's leadership progression.
That makes sense. Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a couple things that you brought up that I want to dig into a little bit more. I have a couple questions around the mentorship and sponsorship, but before that, I want to get into, societal and gender norms. And how do you think that these cultural gender norms have actually shaped how women see themselves?
Sure. It can impact women's leader identity. So we have a lot of implicit leadership theories or these prototypes of what we think leadership should look like. And as
Mm.
I mentioned earlier, being competent, confident, assertive, those are
Generally
not
masculine traits.
very masculine traits.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're not
Yeah.
really supposed to be associated as feminine.
Mm.
And while there's some change in our expectations within culture and society, it still remains that we do expect women to be more warm and nurturing
Mm.
and caring, these communal behaviors, as we put them, whereas men act much more dominant, aggressive, or assertive, much more agentic
Mhm.
traits, so to speak. And those agentic traits are oftentimes associated with leadership or a
Mm.
leadership prototype. Those are what we expect of leaders: to be outspoken, to be sociable in those
Mm.
particular ways. And
Yeah, just
sometimes that
assumptions that we just sort of have about people,
absolutely
how they're going to show up at work, how we expect our
right.
supervisors to be.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
oftentimes these are gender stereotypes that we have of
Right.
how women and men should act, right? And
Yeah.
so that can impact who we see as a leader, because
Mhm.
if women don't act in a certain way, they might be thought of as not very competent, or they might not be seen as very likable. The double bind comes back again.
Mm.
Or they're just acting in a way that's incongruent to how we as a society think they should act. And that
Right.
causes some prejudice in terms of who we think should and should not be a leader.
Gotcha. Do you feel like that brings up, in some people, or based maybe on the research, some internalized misogyny or internalized gender norms? Um, and
Yeah,
maybe any strategies that we could have as a culture to try to uproot some of that?
sure, absolutely. I think it impacts, our idea of who we are as a leader. We can
Mm.
internalize some of that. So the
Yeah.
double bind is society's view, but there is
Right.
a sense of us internalizing these points of view, that we
Right.
should act in a certain way, or if we're not acting in a way that is appropriate to our gender, that is not leader like. And so then we don't think of ourselves as leaders.
Mm.
And that leader
Gotcha.
identity is not something we develop as strongly. And so leader
Mhm.
identity is so important for developing women leaders. They need to think of
Gotcha.
themselves as a leader. They need
Do
to
you think
see themselves in that way.
does that piece of leader identity, from what you've seen, lead to, different goals that women have? Having a goal of being in a leadership position versus maybe not being in a leadership position, or in a
It
more passive
can.
role in a company?
Absolutely. It can. It could impact their motivation to lead
Mm.
or their reasons behind leading. For
Mm.
example, women may lead more towards women might lead because they feel obligated to lead
Mm.
versus wanting to lead. And so in that particular case, because they feel that necessity that they have to lead, they may claim opportunities for leading.
Mm.
Whereas men will lead because they want to lead,
Mm.
or they're given these opportunities to lead, and so they lead. So the
Mm.
motivations are a little bit different. We do see some
Gotcha.
gender differences in those motivation. There's some research on that in terms of their motivation to lead. And so whether or not women see themselves as a leader can be impacted on whether they're granted this opportunity to lead,
Mm.
or if they have to claim the opportunity to lead.
Mm.
Yeah.
Got you.
This
That makes
idea
sense.
of claiming and granting is relates to the
Yeah.
leader identity theory, actually. And so some people are given the opportunity to
Hmm.
lead and take on those leadership positions. So that's
Yeah.
the granting of a leadership position or a leader
Mm.
identity through a position, a title, etc. Some people have to claim it. And these
Mm.
can be in subtle ways, such as stepping forward, creating an
Mm.
agenda for the meeting, especially when there is
Mm.
a leaderless meeting. And
Mm.
so, in those ways, more often than not, women have to claim those opportunities in order to be seen as a leader.
Got you. That makes total sense. In this, we're talking about gender stereotypes, gender norms. Do you see any of that coinciding with things like imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, things like self-silencing? And just real quick, I don't think a lot of our listeners may know what self-silencing is. Might be familiar with imposter syndrome because that's become very popular recently.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, imposter syndrome. I'll be honest, I don't love the term imposter
sure.
syndrome.
Yeah,
Uh, Whether or not I think it really exists is another conversation, because I think the
sure.
word syndrome indicates that there's something wrong with the
Mm.
person
Yeah,
clinically,
I think it's a
right?
great point. Yeah, absolutely.
So
Where
I
it's not a
don't love
clinic,
that
it's not in the
term.
DSM, right? So,
No, it's not.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not. And it's not to
yeah,
invalidate the feelings that someone might feel like they're a fraud. It's
right.
just focused so much on the individual, and typically
Right.
women,
Mm.
and the idea that they have to fix themselves,
Mm.
where the issue is not really around them. It's
The
more on
environment.
a larger level,
Yeah.
whether it be organizational or societal.
Mm.
And so I do have a problem with that idea of
Gotcha.
imposter syndrome. And actually, the researchers who coined the term coined it as imposter phenomenon, not
Hmm.
syndrome. I believe that was in the 70s. And it was imposter phenomenon. Somewhere along the line, it shifted to syndrome. And this
Interesting.
was mostly associated with women, and this
Hmm.
idea that there's something wrong with us as women,
Right.
this clinical syndrome that we might have. But like you said, it's not in the DSM. So I
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
that term. I think I might have gone on a tangent right
Oh
there.
no, that's okay. No, I appreciate the clarification there because I think, imposter syndrome is one of those things that has become really popular. People are self-diagnosing even though it's not a syndrome, right? And
Absolutely.
I think more and more people are becoming aware of it. It's joining our societal lexicon, even in high schoolers now too, not just college students.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. I hear it a lot
Yeah.
from our college students, primarily from our
Yeah.
women,
Mm.
in terms of being a fraud, they're not good enough or whatnot.
Yeah.
And so that leads to that issues of self-confidence. And yes, they are self-diagnosing. And I think social media has promoted this idea of
Yeah.
imposter syndrome. So it's such an interesting phenomenon that people are grappling onto. But you also mentioned earlier in the question
Mm.
stereotype threat.
Yeah, stereotype threat and self-silencing also. Yeah.
So stereotype threat, I think stereotype threat is definitely something that people, especially women, are highly aware of. They're highly aware that people are judging them based on
Mm.
certain stereotypes, especially
Mm.
when they are one of few in perhaps a leadership position. And
Mm.
so it's even more salient for them in those ways, and does have a strong impact on their leader identity, a strong impact on their belief system. And I believe research has been done. I believe it was Crystal Hoyt who did research on looking at how to mitigate stereotype threat, especially for women. And what helps to mitigate stereotype threat is those belief systems. So,
Mm.
building a growth mindset, building your self-efficacy,
Mm.
those kinds of things help to mitigate those ideas of stereotype threat.
In mentioning stereotype threat and then a couple other things they were talking about earlier, it came up, how few women are in leadership and how there are many contexts in where there's maybe only one or two, if it's a good day, of women in the room or on a leadership team. What have you seen, or what do you feel are some of those psychological effects of being the only woman, as part of that leadership team or in one of those roles in an organization?
Absolutely. I think that's a challenge for a lot of women when they are one of few. Oftentimes, they have to prove themselves even more so than others. Oftentimes, that's related to attribution or performance bias, right?
Mhm.
Where they constantly have to show and prove the work that they do. And in those biases, there is work that shows that women are typically promoted based on performance. So they have to prove that they have that performance and that background and the competence, whereas men tend to be promoted based on promise or this idea that they have the potential to do well.
Right.
And so women constantly have to work harder to show that they can lead, show that they are competent. And that really is a lot more that women have to prove, whereas men are not showing that same efforts to some extent.
Right. Right. More pressure.
A lot more
Um,
pressure for
yeah.
women, especially. I think it also creates this, it can create scenarios where women are pitted against each other
Mm.
when there's only a few opportunities for them. So things like the queen bee syndrome
Mm.
can occur where more senior women are not mentoring or are very competitive with
Mm.
up and rising women leaders because there's a sense of, well, I worked hard to get up here, so you need to go through that same
Mm.
kind of,
Perpetuating the same system.
yes, and journey
Yeah.
to get to this position. And it creates some hostility that sometimes women might feel. They may feel hostility in general in the workplace, but the queen bee syndrome can also create that hostility. So it's not just, okay, men are keeping women down. It could also be women having these stereotypes or biases as well. And so it's coming from a lot of different places.
Gotcha. That can make it so difficult. And why do you think there's, this might be a tough question, but why do you think that, um, putting aside so few spots for women in leadership already, but why is it that the spots then seem competitive? Why is this a female leadership spot, and why isn't it competitive for a spot that a male is already occupying?
And that's such a good question. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that is the question. Why is it that
Yeah.
way? Why
Yeah.
have we created a system
Mm.
within organizations, within culture, where only a few are reserved for women?
Hmm.
That's a great question. I think there are historical, there are cultural factors
Yeah.
at play there that are keeping and perpetuating that status quo,
Hmm.
second
And I think
generation gender bias, right?
yeah,
So, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and I think a lot of those things, um, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think kind of perpetuate and undermine, a lot of the merit that women bring to the table, and so and men get put into these positions some of the time, not on a merit-based system. Like you were saying, it's based off more potential. You
Mhm.
have the potential to do it, but maybe that merit isn't showing in the moment like it is for many women, but it's getting overlooked.
Right, right,
Yeah,
exactly. So
yeah,
it's a challenge that we face in many, many spaces.
right. Yeah. Um, we were talking a little bit about, how this shows up within organizations. Are there things that an organization, an HR team, a leadership team, an executive team can do when they're thinking about women in leadership, or as a category, or do they maybe need to kind of break out of that binary and do something else as an organization to kind of help promote some more of that equity or equality?
Absolutely. I think in the hiring phase, one of the things that can be done is to remove names or
Hmm.
to look at just the qualifications a little more blindly. Sometimes when we infer either gender or race on a
Right.
resume, that activates certain biases that we might not be aware of. And
Hmm.
there is research out there that shows that this is the case. There's
Yeah.
the research of Heidi Rosen. I think I can't remember the names. There was a resume, one with Heidi, and then the other resume had a man's name. Well, they would evaluate both resumes, and they evaluated them differently.
Right.
Exactly the same, just the name change.
Mm.
Similar research with different races and ethnicities, a name that was more ethnic versus a name that was not as ethnic. Same qualifications, exactly the same, different judgments on these particular resumes. And catching those biases that you might have is also important in
Mm.
that particular situation.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of different factors at place, but those are some things that the research is showing. So paying
Mm.
attention to those things and being aware that these things are happening, and even having a more diverse hiring committee perhaps
Right.
might help to mitigate some of those issues as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, and help mitigate a lot more of the nepotism that,
Hmm.
does tend to perpetuate a lot of larger organizations, I think.
Yeah.
And kind of on that, and going a little bit back to a couple things that you mentioned around mentorship and sponsorship. Um, First, do you mind just quickly delineating, for our listeners, the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, how important that is to leadership in general, but then what is that unique impact that they have on women in leadership as well?
Sure. So mentors are those individuals that help and give advice on a number of topics or issues that you can seek out. So if you have a mentor, you're having some issues in the workplace, how do I navigate this? What have
Mm.
you done? What have you experienced? Having those kind of mentors and conversations can be very valuable. Sponsors, and you can probably see this on a continuum. So, sponsors are much more engaged with individuals, mentors not being less so, but in terms of advocacy,
Mm.
sponsors are much more likely to advocate for individuals.
Mm.
They hear about an opportunity and they will say, you know what? I have a great person for that
Mm.
job. Austin would be amazing. And putting your name out there, that's what a
Gotcha.
sponsor does.
Gotcha.
And the hope is that you're going to prove this sponsor right, make the sponsor look good as well. So
Mm.
there's a
Right.
win-win, right? In
Right.
these
Yeah.
kind of developmental relationships that occur. Another developmental relations within networks as well. But
Mm.
that's the difference between mentors and sponsors. Research finds that women have mentors, but they don't have a lot of access to sponsors.
Mm.
Their mentor groups are not as powerful
Mm.
as men's mentors, and the lack of access that they do have to sponsors may be part of the reason why their name is not rising up the list on when leadership opportunities are
Mm.
available. So that there is research that
Okay.
shows that and exhibits that. And so that is why sponsors can be very, very valuable for women. It's a
Mm.
matter of getting and seeking out those sponsors. Women have to work
Right.
a little harder in those particular realms and realize that not all mentors or sponsors look the same.
Mhm.
Perhaps people could have a personal board of directors where they have a
Right.
couple of mentors, a couple of sponsors, or maybe one sponsor, a mentor, a coach, a different
Mm.
network, peers that help advise them in that leadership journey that they have.
Mm.
Because leadership is such a relational, such an interpersonal type of activity that
Right.
oftentimes you might need others to kind of support you throughout that journey.
Right. That makes sense. For our listeners who are, maybe wanting to take a dip into leadership, not sure how to start with getting a mentor or build a relationship to get a sponsor, are there any sort of like initial things that you would recommend? Maybe, undergrads or people at entry level jobs who are trying to figure out how to generate and cultivate these relationships?
Yeah. I think especially for undergrads, connecting with older peers. So if you
Mm.
are a younger undergrad, connecting with some of the seniors who could be
Mm.
mentors for you in the internship process,
Mm.
connecting with individuals you've met at internships
Mm,
or in other jobs in industries that are where you want to go into.
mm,
Another opportunity is looking into the alumni network at
mm,
your university. There's a rich network there. There may be someone who would love to connect and be a mentor. Sometimes mentoring relationships take a little more time to develop, and sometimes you meet someone and it's just not the right fit. So
right.
maybe going to these alumni events, sometimes they happen much more organic. Some colleges and universities have more structured mentoring programs,
Mm,
and so those are opportunities to try and develop those relationships. There are many different ways in which to seek out mentors. And along the way, hopefully, you create that really strong mentorship relationship and it becomes more of a sponsorship relationship.
Something you said that I think comes up a lot with my students when they're asking me things along these lines that I don't think a lot of clicks for a lot of people is you don't just automatically get a mentor or a sponsor. It's a relationship that you do have to cultivate, and it takes you stepping outside of your comfort zone probably at that beginning point.
Absolutely. And it's not just about meeting a bunch of people and that's
Right.
networking. It's
Yeah.
really creating
Don't
these
just collect
deeper
business cards.
relationships. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Um, so we were talking about how to generate mentors, getting outside of the comfort zone, and then also some of these gender roles that kind of get superimposed and all of that. And I want to kind of in line with that talk about skill sets. Are there different skill sets between male leaders and female leaders, whether it's soft skills, hard skills? I know that some of the research seems to be mixed, and I know that public discourse is all across the board on it. But is there a score you want to settle around this?
The research is mixed, and I
Mm,
think that the gender differences that have been found are really small in
mm,
general.
yeah,
Anyone can be a leader.
mm,
There are not a certain set of traits
mm,
that dictate who is a leader and who is not a leader. Context matters, and
yeah,
certain behaviors might be more desirable in one context as a leader versus other contexts.
mm,
And so realizing that leadership can take many, many forms. And so
mm,
if we think of leadership as this system, leadership is not just about the leader, it's also about the followers and that context,
mm,
right? And so there are three parts to this system. What one follower might need might not be the same as another follower, and it may be different in a different context. So these traits, these behaviors that we deem as leadership might have to be different from task to task.
mm,
And
mm,
so it's not to say that men are better at one thing and women are better at the other thing. Oftentimes we say, okay, women are much more interpersonal and more sociable because they're caring and nurturing. That's the
mm.
stereotype we have.
Right.
That's not to say men can't have those interpersonal skills.
And some of the best
They're
leaders do. Who some of the best male leaders do have those
right.
interpersonal
They
skills.
are
Yeah.
extroverted, they are sociable,
Yeah.
and can build those skills. Those are developable skills,
Mm,
right? Interpersonal skills are skills that can be practiced and can be developed by men, by women, and
mm,
any other gender in between.
mm,
And so it's about working on those particular
mm,
skills. It's not that one gender or the other gender is predisposed to a certain skill.
mm,
Even in personality, if we look at
mm,
personality theories, gender differences are not that strong.
mm,
So it oftentimes we think of traits as building leadership. It's not just about leadership traits. There's behaviors and skills that we can develop, and those can be developed by men and women equally. The issue that comes, for example, negotiation.
mm,
Negotiation is a really important skill in leadership, and
yeah.
there was I don't know, about 5, 10 years ago, research saying women did not negotiate. And so there was a big push at developing those particular skills for women. Turns out women do negotiate. What's happening is that while women and men are both negotiating, women don't get what they ask for. Men do.
Mm,
And so the research has shifted to look at why is this happening? A
mm,
lot of it comes back to some of those gender norms, gender stereotypes. If women are negotiating in a way that does not seem in line with their gender, so
mm,
stereotypically, so it's not very communal, they're really focused on themselves and promoting themselves, they're less likely to get what they want. But if they
mm,
negotiate in a way that's a little more communal, this is for the best, that this is the best opportunity for the whole, the
mm,
organization, not just me,
mm,
then they can typically have more successful negotiations. So we
mm,
do see those difference. It's not so much that
mm.
men and women are different, but we perceive them to be different.
Gotcha. I really appreciate you clearing that up because we hear so much of that discourse, and I think there are a lot of examples in many companies, even large Fortune 500 companies, where they may be selecting leadership based off of this preconceived notion of men and women having different skill sets, and just
Absolutely.
making this
Yeah.
assumption when that's not the case at all.
Mhm.
Um, and you've talked a little bit about, where it was historically and where we are now. Are there any specific directions in the cultural narrative that we currently have that you would like to see it take in the future that you think we should be trying to move towards?
Think that narrative needs to shift away from fixing women
Mm,
and fixing the systems and the societal expectations we have.
mm,
Because a lot of why women may not be getting into leadership and may not be advancing is not so much that they don't have the experience, the skills, the education, or any
mm,
of those kind of merits. It's more along the idea of who we perceive should be a
mm,
leader, how they should lead, what they should look like.
mm,
And so shifting those perceptual ideas of leaders to encompass more,
right.
encompass more types of leaders, I think is where we need to shift. It's not that women, okay, we need to develop negotiation skills, we need to develop communication skills. Yeah, we do need to develop those things. Men need to develop those things as well. We
Absolutely.
all, if we want to be a leader, a good leader, we need
Yeah.
to develop certain skills. But I feel like the focus has always been, well, women need this, and that will help us get to equity and equality in leadership.
Mm,
Well, women are developing these things, but we're still not seeing that big needle shift. It's shifted a little bit,
mm,
right? As you
yeah.
mentioned earlier, 11% of CEOs in the Fortune 500s, that's the largest it's ever been,
Yeah.
but that's still nowhere near
It's so
50%.
small. Exactly.
Exactly,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
That's just a few women. If one woman CEO retires and is not replaced by another woman, well, that goes
Mm,
back down to like 9%,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
those are things that need to shift is I think culturally our ideas of what leadership should look like and who should be a leader. There should not be a
Yeah.
should in any of those
I,
ideas.
I agree. Yeah. And taking it more back to, we shouldn't have to split up this narrative into women in leadership. It's just leadership.
Yes.
Whoever can
Yeah,
step up and has the ability to should and can, regardless of
absolutely.
some of these stereotypes. Is there anything that organizations, and this may part of this may be coming off as a partially loaded question, and please come at me. But anything that organizations and or men can do to help, broaden this cultural narrative, expand it, kind of get it moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think men are absolutely an important part of this equation. They can be allies in ways and support and advocate for women and all who
Mm,
really deserve those kind of opportunities. Being
mm,
sponsors, being mentors, being allies, being advocates, really shifting their lens to understand where their biases might lie.
mm.
I think we all need to do that because we all
Yep,
have biases. I mean,
yep,
that's something we can't escape, but being
yep.
aware of that and
Mm,
educating ourselves
mm,
so that we can advocate for women, advocate for those who should be uplifted into those kinds of leadership trajectories and
right.
opportunities.
Cool. Awesome. Is there any, I want to give you an opportunity to tackle any sort of myths or misconceptions kind of in the public discourse, kind of sort of lift the veil. We have so much misinformation these days. I like to give an opportunity to anything that, that does bug you, that you see that comes across, or maybe that comes into your classrooms, that maybe runs contrary to research.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of myths out there. I think this idea that women can't lead, obviously, we've been talking about
Mhm.
this, and women can lead.
Yeah.
They do have the skills and opportunities to lead. And there's actually research showing where, in some cases, people feel that women are more competent leaders.
Mm,
And so that's been a little bit of a stereotype shift. We're not
right.
seeing differences in who is leading, but there is
Mm,
that kind of idea. I think that has shifted as we tend to see more collaborative work be
mm,
embraced and these
mm,
ideas of relationships being embraced and being an essential part of leadership. Because
mm,
sometimes we stereotypically think of relationships being much more of a feminine kind
right.
of task to maintain, but that's not to say it doesn't happen in all genders.
Mm,
I think another myth we kind of already touched upon was this idea of imposter syndrome.
mhm.
So I'm not going to go into that.
Sure.
It's not a syndrome.
Right.
uh, and this idea that women are not confident. Eh,
Mm,
There's, I think, a lot out there in terms of girls and women, in terms of there being a confidence gap, and women lack this confidence. And perhaps part of that is because of the idea that they're not seeing enough women as leaders. But at the same time, I don't know if confidence is enough. We don't
mm,
need to just promote women's confidence. I think we need to really shift the system, as we were
mm,
talking about, and how we see women and how we see leaders and leadership
mm,
to really broaden that perspective. And
mm,
so I think it's not just about building women's confidence and then they're going to be these leaders, or as we talked about earlier, women developing certain skills and then we need to fix them and they're going to be leaders. But I think it's really moving away from that idea that it's just the women who have to work so hard to get at that position of
mm,
leadership, that this idea that it's a women's issue. It's
mm.
not a women's issue, it's a societal issue. It's
Absolutely.
a part of our system and what is going on. So we need to look and develop some systemic ideas of how we support more equity, not
Mm,
just gender-wise, racial and ethnic equity
mm,
along across the board, I think is important.
mm. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Um, you, you were talking a little bit in that answer, and then in some other ones earlier around, you know, how to develop as a leader. Is there anything that you think is currently lacking in general, not at the Kravitz Leadership Institute, but in the general leadership development in organizations, that you think, could be tuned up, or that you would probably advise some changes in leadership development strategies, tactics, education, anything like that?
In leadership development, I think we all need to remember that development is a lifelong journey.
Mm,
A one day workshop, one day
mm,
activity
One
is
weekend
not going
retreat.
right.
Yeah.
Even a weekend retreat, it's
Yeah.
not enough to develop your leadership. It's not like, oh, all of a sudden I am a leader because I went to this one workshop. I know
Yeah.
everything there needs to be
I
done
have the
about
paper
it,
that says it.
right? Uh, it's more than that. It
Yeah.
really is this lifelong journey and continually working on your development, thinking about your development as a leader, either through reflection and journaling, working with a leadership coach to set more specific goals, but thinking of it as this long term development opportunity versus a one-time thing, and really
Mm.
getting it in our heads that every experience, every opportunity is something that we can learn from to help us become better leaders.
Mm.
And so whether or not we have that role or position or title, we
Mm.
can be developing and working on our leadership. We can utilize our leadership skills without a role, a title, position. There are many ways in which we can practice leadership every single day.
Mm. I love that. Thank you. There's, I think, this misconception that only leaders get to practice being leaders, but so often some of the strongest followers in an organization are showing leadership skills on the daily. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any, as we sort of wrap up, is there any advice that you would give to women or just anybody in general who's navigating that early to mid-career leadership path that may be listening to it and listening to this and kind of trying to figure out what their next step is or how to further develop? Now they know they need to stay in that growth mindset and that there's no end point. But any other advice that you would like to add on?
I think advice that I would give is really working on not just yourself, but also calling out when you see bias happening, when you see something that doesn't seem right. Like oftentimes women are interrupted. They're interrupted 3 times more than men when a woman is interrupted. So even a woman or a man can say, hold on, I'd love to hear more of what this person has to say. So calling those things out. Yes, we need to develop ourselves as leaders, but also looking at the bigger picture of who is being silenced in some ways and calling those things out, I think is really important. And
Oh
so
yeah,
that's what I would say.
I appreciate that you said that. I think there's a lot of spaces, academia, corporate spaces, that where so much of that goes unnoticed, unsaid, unspoken, and unaddressed because in those moments, in those contexts, they are so small. They seem small and kind of menial, but in aggregate, that is really what is perpetuating a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here.
Absolutely.
And so sort of having that courage and that strength, whether you're a man or a woman, to speak up on it, I think is great advice. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Um, is there anywhere that you would recommend any listeners that want to follow up on your work and the things that you're doing can find you? Any pieces you'd like to direct them to?
Sure. I'm on Instagram at Sherylle Tan, at SheryLleTan. I also have a website. It's SherylleTan.com. So I know my first name is spelled a little differently. So SheryLleTan.com. So
Awesome.
my work can be found on my website, and I often like to post when things are going on. A lot of issues around women in leadership, especially.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And we'll also have that in the description for those who are interested. Those will be hyperlinked. But with that, thank you so much for joining us, Sherylle, on this episode of Women in Leadership. You remind us that leadership isn't just about positions, but it's about development and identity and opportunity and these systems that really do shape who gets to lead. I really do hope that our listeners found value today. I invite them all to really take a moment to reflect on any stories that they have personally internalized over their lives about leadership for themselves or for others in their life, and how they can play a role in creating a more equitable and fair and just workplace where women can thrive, but all individuals can thrive. And if you did enjoy this episode, please do share it with somebody who you think cares about leadership and equity and personal growth. And again, thank you to all of our listeners who listen to Eco Over It. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.